Hello, and welcome to our sensory workshop to help you gain a further understanding around sensory processing. This presentation will aim for you to have a greater understanding of sensory processing and how it can impact on behaviour in daily life. It will also provide strategies that will help you in managing sensory processing difficulties for your child.
Firstly, let's explore what occupational therapy is. Occupational therapists work with individuals to assess their occupational performance. In other words, to assess how they carry out things that they do every day. They do this by looking at the individual, they'll look at the skills they have, they'll look at their motivation and their understanding of the tasks that they're being asked to do. They also look at the task itself. They'll break this down into steps and they'll look at how they can make this easier for the person to achieve success. And finally, occupational therapists will also look at the environment in which an individual and the task is taking place. They'll look at things like seating, distractions, and any other kind of environmental support that could help the person to achieve success in performing the task.
We have 8 main senses. 5 of those are the well-known senses. Those are smell, sight, taste, touch, and hearing. But we also have 3 other hidden senses. Those are interoception, vestibular, and proprioception. We will go through these 3 in more detail in the next slides. Proprioception is our sense that allows our body to know where we are positioned in space and where our body parts are in relation to each other. So, for example, if we raise our arms above our head, we know where our arms are without having to look at them. The brain also receives feedback from all of our joints via receptors about their position, their movement, the force and resistance required for an activity. So, for example, if you see a box of heavy books that you have to pick up, your brain will receive this information and then will prepare your body to know how much force it's going to have to use to be able to pick up that heavy box successfully. This sense also allows us to know how we are moving without looking and provides us the foundation for learning fluid movement skills, which will then allow us to participate in our activities for daily living. We have a short YouTube video link included on this slide, which goes into a little bit more detail about the sense of proprioception.
So some things that we might see if a child has difficulties with proprioception. They may appear clumsy, knocking into things, furniture and people. They may appear to have poorly graded movements and rely mainly upon their vision. They may have difficulties putting clothes on as they are not aware where their body is in space and where their arm needs to go through the hole in their t-shirt or jumper. They might have difficulty getting into certain positions, again because they're not sure where their body is in space. They may also have difficulties with sitting still and focusing.
The vestibular system is the sense that lets us know how we are moving. It is the leading sense that supports us with our balance and also our coordination. It sends information to our muscles that we use to keep us upright and to control our posture, and also to the muscles that allow us to move our eyes. It works very closely with our auditory system and also our proprioceptive system, which we spoke about previously, and helps us to carry out all of our movements that we're required to in a smooth fashion. It's very important for helping us to develop our gross motor skills. So that's our walking, our running, crawling if you're a baby, but helps us to develop them as we grow up. Some of the difficulties that we may see a person with vestibular processing issues experiencing include the feeling of gravitational insecurity. They will not like when their feet are not in contact with the ground. And you may see individuals like this staying towards the edge of rooms, not wanting to climb on any playground equipment or on tables, on chairs. They may have an aversion to movement and actually become quite nauseous because of it. So they could have motion sickness because although their eyes don't show that there's any movement in the environment, they may be organizing information in a fashion that leads their brain to think that there is movement. And that can happen a lot in things like lifts, can definitely happen on escalators, and they may actually dislike and not want to use those objects in society. Any sorts of kind of upside down or sideways head movements can also make that person feel unwell. And these are in terms of young children, the type of children that really will not like being thrown in the air and will let you know that in their behaviour.
The next sense is one called interoception. Now, this is a really tricky sense to unpick as it is the awareness of our internal organs and the messages that they are telling us. So, for example, it's our knowledge and knowing that we are feeling when we're feeling hungry, thirsty, when we need to go to the bathroom, when we're too hot or too cold, and then we can take the appropriate actions to remedy those things. So sometimes if children maybe are not getting enough information through their interoceptive sense, they may have difficulties with temperature regulation. For example, they may get really hot and not realise that they need to be taking off their jumper if they're running around, or they may not realise that they need to put on clothes if they're running around outside in shorts and t-shirts when it's actually really cold. They might have difficulties with potty training as they might not be getting the signals to know when they have to go to the bathroom. They may also not quite know when they are full and so they keep eating, or they might go for hours and hours and not eat anything because they're not getting the messages that they're actually hungry. This can make this sense one of the most difficult to implement strategies for, as obviously we can't get inside the child and see what their internal things are doing. So this can sometimes, some of these things can be remedied through gradual and normal development, but a child might need additional strategies just to remind them to do things regularly, even if maybe they're not getting the message themselves.
So we will briefly talk about touch. We have different types of touch, and we'll firstly talk about discriminative touch. And this tells us where and what is being touched without looking at something. So if you think about looking for a pen at the bottom of your bag, you're able to feel around your bag and know when you have found your pen because of how it feels. And you can do this all without looking. We also have types of touch that has an effect on our levels of calmness and alertness. Firstly, we have our protective touch, and this is our body response to light touch or anything that is unexpected, and it helps to alert us and wake us up to anything that is potentially dangerous and that we might need to respond to. Secondly, we have our deep touch, and this is generally calming to our body and helps us switch off the protective response system. Okay, so we're going to have a bit of a quiz. Let's think about the following activities: riding a bike, brushing our teeth, and making a cup of coffee. And think about what senses you are going to use. When you're ready, click to reveal the answers. You can see these activities require a lot of our sensory systems. If we have difficulty with one of our sensory systems, this can impact us on being able to complete everyday activities. For example, let's think if we had a difficulty with our proprioception system. When we come to brush our teeth, we could have difficulties in being able to apply the toothpaste onto the toothbrush, being able to put the toothbrush into our mouth with ease due to difficulties of not knowing where our body is in space. We might have difficulties in applying the right amount of force through the toothbrush onto our teeth.
This slide shows the graph of a bell curve, and we use this just to demonstrate how we all sit in terms of our sensory preferences. Sensory preferences are preferences that we all have, irregardless of whether we have sensory needs or not. There will be some things that we like more than others, some things that we feel pretty much the same as other people feel about them, and there'll be other things that we absolutely choose to avoid because they just don't make us feel very comfortable. An example of that could be the smell of flowers. Some people may absolutely adore them, love them, think they're the best things in the world and fill their houses with lots of fresh flowers or their gardens. Other people might not be that bothered. They're a bit like, oh, yeah, flowers, they're all right, they're cool. They have no problem with them. Whereas other people may actually really dislike fresh flowers and, when possible, avoid them. There could be several reasons for that. One in particular could be that fresh flowers triggers their hay fever. So that's just one example, but of course there are multiple. See if you can have a think about any of them and think about where you would sit on the bell curve. How do you feel about touching raw meat when you need to prepare it? Or how do you feel about riding on roller coasters? See if you can think of a few more. On this slide, we have a link to a YouTube video that we feel really illustrates the impact of different types of sensory information. Please have a watch.
We like to just highlight that in the UK currently, sensory processing is not a standalone diagnosis that's given. However, it is used as a description of difficulties. That's not to say that in other countries this is the same, and so when you're reading literature it can be quite confusing because they have different diagnostic criteria. However, in the UK it's just used to describe difficulties related with other conditions.
The sensory process. Our sensory systems send information to our brain via their receptors. The brain then interprets and tries to understand this information and organises and categorises it as necessary. It then makes a plan which leads to the action that we make, the behaviours that we see.
We receive different sensory inputs from different receptors around the body depending on the sense that we are trying to process. So for example, with our vision, it will be the optic nerve at the back of the eye. With touch, it'll be the receptors on our skin.
As our brain receives all of this sensory information, imagine yourself queuing in the supermarket. This is exactly how our sensory information is received in the brain. So each sensory piece of information is queuing and waiting to be processed to give us a behaviour. This is important to understand to explain why children may go into meltdown, because their brain isn't quite coping with all the different pieces of information that it's got queued up, and therefore they may just end up becoming too overwhelmed and shutting down because they can't process it. This can also be affected by the mood that you're in. Some days, if you're feeling better, it's a lot easier to manage what's going on. Other days, it's not.
So to further illustrate the importance of the sensory system, we're going to do this by building a house, so please do bear with us. So in a house, we need good, strong foundations at the bottom of the walls. And our sensory system is our foundation to building skills and learning. So these need to be nice and strong.
Next, we have the walls of our house. So for our walls, we have all our skills that we're developing. We've got our crossing of the midline, discovering we've got two different sides of the body, controlling the movement of our eyes, being able to sit up and stand up. And we want these to be nice and strong so that we can then build our roof.
So the roof is what we call our activities of daily living. So these are things that we need to do every day, such as self-care tasks, such as washing and dressing, also listening and attending whilst at school to be able to do our academic work, playing, maintaining that upright posture and being able to sit, and developing those fine and gross motor skills, so being able to do our buttons, our zips, our shoelaces, being able to jump, skip, hop. And this all works together with the walls and the foundations to obviously then build our house.
So now we've built our house. As you can see, our house is strong because we have a solid foundation. We've got solid walls, which has meant that we can then have a stable base to put all our skills in our roof on top. If we ever have any areas where we haven't quite developed the skill, or if we have any holes in our foundation, that immediately makes our house less stable. And that's the same with our sensory systems. If we're having difficulties somewhere in our sensory system, then it means that it's harder for us to be able to build and develop skills so that we can then carry out our activities of daily living. The ideal state that our sensory system needs to be in is the calm alert state. In this state, we are calm enough and also alert enough to be able to carry out focused activities that we need to complete. For some individuals, they can become overstimulated, and this can switch on something called the fight, flight, or freeze reactions. You may have a child who's overstimulated who could be kicking or hitting out, that's the fight element. They may run away, that's the flight element, or they may shut down and freeze and not do anything, which is the freeze element. You can also have the opposite. An individual can be understimulated. They may come across as quite low, a bit sleepy, and a bit slow. Neither of these stages are ideal for us to be able to carry out our tasks. It's important to note that everybody throughout the day moves in and out of a calm alert state. So an example of that would be waking up first thing in the morning, you're quite low, feeling still a bit tired. So you might play some music just to get you energized and wake you up and bring you into that calm alert state. Throughout the day, you may get called into the office at school, and because you're not sure what you're going to be told, you might be a little bit overstimulated, and then when you find out that you've got a good grade, you may be even more overstimulated because you're happy and you're celebrating. And then you need to calm back down and you'll be able to focus on your schoolwork. And when you're getting towards the end of the day, you may find that you're then beginning to become understimulated again, just because then you're getting ready for bed and you're not needing to be in the calm alert state to focus on any activity.
So, following on from what we've just learnt about staying in the calm alert or the just right state, we have conceptualised this to make it a little bit easier to follow. So, as we saw in the previous slide about being understimulated, we like to say that this might be like Eeyore in the low category. So what does Eeyore look like? He's lethargic, he moves slowly, he looks tired. If he was a child, he might be slumped in his chair. He might have difficulty staying alert and staying focused with attention. And he might seem flat or passive. Now, that's not very constructive for following in class and being able to do work. However, if we then move on to the just right or the calm alert stage, we would look at Winnie the Pooh. Now, what does Winnie the Pooh look like? He's good at listening and learning. He's attending to what the teacher is saying. He's following instructions. He's waiting patiently, and he's able to focus and concentrate in class. Now, there'll be other children who are overstimulated, and this moves into the high category. Now, those children are split again into two. So it might be Tigger, who's having a lot of difficulty sitting still and paying attention. He's fidgeting, he's talking loudly, wriggling around in his chair, and he's generally what we would call on the go. But we also have other children who are still in the high category of being overstimulated, but are more like Piglet. They're also not able to concentrate, but they might be anxious and stressed, might be a bit irritable. Now, if these children at this point aren't given strategies to come back into the just right or calm alert state, then we might end up in the higher phase with the Incredible Hulk. And these children might have become very, very angry and very out of control. At this point, we don't really think that any strategies are going to work in bringing them back down. And we would advise removing all the sensory stimuli, so turning down the lights, talking in a quieter voice or trying not to talk to them as much, turning off any music, any other, we just want to decrease the amount of sensory stimuli that their systems are having to process at this point. And once they've settled back down, we can then implement some of our strategies to bring them back into the just right stage.
Something important we'd like to mention is called sensory modulation. Sensory modulation is looking at regulating our responses to sensations or responses to sensory information that we receive. If we're habituated to something, meaning we're used to something, it's normal, it means that we can receive that sensory information and then we deal with it and then we can move on and get on with our daily activities. However, if we're not habituated to something and we're quite sensitive to it, it means that we receive that information, and even though we may try to deal with it, we may try to process that information, we still find that that particular piece of sensory information, we're quite sensitive to it and we can't quite move past it and get on with our daily activities. So a really good example of that is clothing. Generally, many people will get dressed in the mornings. You know you have clothes on, you've processed that information, it's comfortable, you can get on with the rest of your day. You can go to school, you can go to work, you can go and play with friends, etc. However, for those who are quite sensitive to their clothing or they find certain types of material for their clothing uncomfortable, when they receive this sensory input through their tactile system, it keeps nagging them. It's almost like somebody poking you all the time. And you'll find that they fidget with their clothing a lot. They try and move it around to try and get comfortable because their sensory system is alert to the fact that they're wearing clothes, but they're finding it quite uncomfortable. So we all have sensory modulation. It's just that the majority of us tend to habituate to the sensory information that we receive. However, some of us, and particularly for those with sensory needs, whether it's avoiding, seeking, they have some sensitization to sensory information that they receive.
We all have different thresholds for different sensory stimuli. For example, some people will have a low threshold for certain senses, showing that they have a little cup and don't need a lot of sensory input in order to notice. Take the example of people eating a curry. Some people will find that a relatively mild curry, for example a korma, is quite spicy and they don't need any more spice to be able to enjoy the meal. However, other people who have a high threshold for that sense may need a lot of sensory input and will have what's called a big cup to be able to enjoy their meal. And they may eat exactly the same meal but find that they need a lot of spice to be able to enjoy it. It must be noted that our thresholds for sensory stimuli changes frequently depending on our mood, what we're doing that day, and our levels of fatigue.
So we can see different behaviours when it comes to each threshold. With a little cup, a low threshold, a little bit feels like a lot. Some little cups know to avoid overfilling their cup, so they'll stay away from things that they don't like. They know that it'll be too much for them. However, some little cups don't know how to avoid overfilling their cup, so they'll keep going and their cup will just fill up until it becomes too full and starts to overflow. This is where we might see that children become easily upset and they might seem a little bit more sensitive. On the rest of the slide and the following slide, there are examples for within each sensory system of behaviours that you might see for a little cup.
So some of the behaviours that we may see with an individual that has a low threshold in certain sensory systems are listed below. If you have a low threshold for touch, which is your tactile system, then a child may avoid things like messy play. That can include finger painting, playing with sand, playing with water. They may become quite distressed if they're forced to do things like that also. They may also struggle to sit to have things like their nails cut or their hair brushed. And in some cases, they may actually find it painful, depending on how severely low their threshold is for that input. For taste and for smell, children may prefer certain tastes and generally tend to only go for those tastes, not usually open to trying new foods, new flavours. And they'll also notice and react to smells a lot more obviously and overtly compared to their peers. With vision, you may see that they're quite aversive to bright lights. They may shy away from that. They may often shield their eyes from the sun. They may always want to wear sunglasses. That's just their way of trying to manage how much their little cup is getting overfilled. And with things like movement, you may have a child who gets worried when they're going on a swing, if they might end up going upside down. They might not like having their feet off the ground and have a little bit of gravitational insecurity.
So, for individuals who have a high threshold or a big cup for some sensory stimuli, a lot will feel like a little. And some big cups do things to fill up their cup. They might be busy all the time, they might be running around, seeking lots and lots of movement to fill up their cup so that they feel regulated and they look like they're just constantly on the go. However, some big cups don't do anything to fill up their cup and they might seem a bit distracted, a bit dreamy, and a bit lost in a world of their own because they haven't realised that they need to be doing lots of sensory seeking to be able to fill up their cup. Now, over the next few slides, you'll see what big cups look like in terms of different senses.
So some of the things that you may see with an individual who has a big cup, so a very high threshold, needing lots of information to recognise that sensory input, are listed below. So with touch, which is our tactile system, these individuals may like lots of physical contact. So they love receiving and giving hugs. In terms of their playing, it might be quite rough and really quite overwhelming for others who don't have such a high threshold. But the reason they're seeking that and they're trying to get that is because that's the only way they can tell and get that input they need for their touch system. They'll absolutely love things like messy play. They'll be the ones that have gone out digging and playing in the garden, and they'll come back absolutely drenched in mud. And they're okay with that. They can cope with it. When we're looking at taste and smell, they may like really strong flavours of food. A really nice thing is that they're more likely to try new foods when you introduce them because they want to try different things. In terms of auditory and hearing, they may talk loudly when it's not actually necessary. They may also listen to loud music or have the TV or their phone turned up louder than it needs to be. And then others may have to tell them to turn it down. And with vision, they may actually really enjoy things like bright lights and shiny things. They may like rotary movement because that makes their eyes spin around as it spins around. Because they have such a big cup, things like that wouldn't make them feel dizzy or sick.
So here we have another quiz for you all. Below are examples of statements relating to the different sensory systems, and what we'd like you to do is try to think whether it relates to having a big cup or a little cup. Please click to reveal the answers.
In this slide, we're going to look at the reasons behind the behaviours that we see in our children. So we've got to ask the question, is this a sensory behaviour we're seeing, or is it a non-sensory behaviour? It's important to remember that all behaviour has a function, and we need to identify the reasons for the behaviour, as not all behaviour is sensory. So what questions do we need to ask? Firstly, what need is the behaviour filling? Is the child seeking to gain something from this behaviour? Or are they seeking to avoid something because you've just asked them to do something they really don't want to do? It's really important to remember that the behaviour you're seeing might be sensory, or it might be something else, or it might be a mixture of both. And you've got to be the investigator to try and work out which parts might be sensory and therefore supported with strategies, and which parts come from a non-sensory base and maybe better supported with behavioural strategies, for example, reward charts. The next question is to ask is it a problem and to who? Now, some sensory behaviours that we see are quite inappropriate outside of the home, but if they're in the home, they're actually okay and there's not a problem. But this is going to be a really personal decision that you will decide which behaviour is appropriate and whether you need to do something about it or not.
We all have natural modulators, and these are things that we do every day without thinking to help keep ourselves calm but also alert and focused so we're able to carry out the activity that we need to carry out. Our vestibular and proprioceptive systems naturally tend to organise our calm and alertness levels. And we do this by doing things such as chewing gum, clicking our pen, tapping a foot, maybe even humming a little tune. I do want to add that some of these things that we naturally do, other people find annoying and actually upsets their sensory system, but it does help our own sensory system. It's really important to know this because some children will try to naturally calm and organise their sensory system. And they may do this by, for example, tapping a pencil on the table. However, in their efforts, because of the environment they're in, they may be told off or they may be told to stop, which means that then they can't really regulate their sensory information. So it's really important that we're aware of this and we take note of this because if required, it gives us a really good base and a really massive clue on the sort of strategies that we can look at replacing that will give the same effect but maybe be more appropriate for the classroom. So for a child that maybe taps their pencil, it could be more useful for them to have a piece of putty that they've kept on their table, and then they can hit their pencil on that. They're still getting the hitting motion, so they're getting that movement that they're seeking in their wrist if that's the reason they're doing it. But when it's connecting with that putty, it's not making any noise, meaning it's not distracting other members of the classroom. So just to run through the types of patterns that we see with different types of input that provide calming and alerting. Calming input tends to be quite predictable and repetitive, so you know it's going to happen, you know how it's going to happen, where it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and how much of it is going to happen, so that you can remain calm, so that you're not sort of put on high alert because you're thinking, oh, what has happened? Firm touch, so deep pressure, massage, things like that can be very calming. Sometimes you will see linear movement, particularly in children who may have autistic spectrum disorder when they kind of rock forwards and backwards. That's very calming. Calming can also be seen as quite slow and rhythmical. So it might be, doing something slowly to calming classical music. Generally, more mild flavours, moderate cooling temperatures can be quite calming. Smells such as lavender is always quite a calming scent for people. Sticking to soft colours, pastel colours, and generally quite slow and quiet music can all be ways of inducing calming for people if they need to be calmed down. When we're looking at alerting and the sorts of ways that we need to be inducing that to help wake people up, we need to be quite unpredictable, catching people off guard. It could be as simple as rather than running in a straight line, you're going to run and get them to change directions suddenly and they won't know which direction you're going to ask. Light touch, such as tickling, can be quite alerting. If you're a parent and obviously with your child, tickling feet can sometimes be very alerting. Rotary movement, so doing circles and spinning is very alerting. We always say with rotary movement, just be careful. Definitely look at how the individual's responding because for some people it can be quite nauseating. So we don't want that bit, we just want the alerting bit. Fast and changing patterns, usually strong flavours, so you might want to go for some spice, you might want to go for some cold sort of ice, things like that in terms of temperature. Strong smells such as coffee, bananas. Bright colours, so you want really bright yellows, really strong reds, deep colours, and then fast and loud music, so whether it's rock, whether it's really fast tempo, anything along those lines is going to be quite alerting and quite waking up of the system. Now what we're going to do is go through the different types of sensory strategies that could be useful to support children who have different sensory needs. Sensory diets, what are they? So a sensory diet is essentially a program of activities that can be provided throughout a child's day to help them to gain the correct sensory information they need in order to be able to actively stay in a calm, alert state so that they can always be in the optimal state for learning and playing and paying attention and waiting and listening and all the other things that they need to do throughout their day. These are really good for, to be honest, anybody, but really good for children who have quite severe difficulties with processing sensory information from their environment. And they need quite intense support to help them with regulating and organising that information. Some activities that are done in a sensory diet can have an immediate effect. Others, it will have an effect over the time, and sometimes it can have an effect immediate and then last over time as well. But generally these activities need to be done regularly and they need to be done over a long period of time in terms of sequence and amount for a lasting effect. An example of a sensory diet could be as simple as completing a sensory circuit, which I will explain further in a later slide, in the morning. Then they may have a lesson. Then maybe towards the end of that lesson, getting ready for a transition, a child may then get to do some heavy work, which could be collecting all the textbooks and putting them away, or they may get to do some star jumps to help them to wake them back up before they can then transition to their next lesson. Activities like that would be spaced throughout the day. Some activities can be quite small, some activities might require a little bit more room, a different room or equipment. It just depends on the child. But a sensory diet can be prescribed by an occupational therapist and given to school to carry out. Sensory diets should be timetabled where possible. This allows the sensory input to be organised and also timetabled for regular intervals throughout the child's day. So it's effectively a bit like a tick box, but it means that that child's getting the regular input they need. They're more likely then to be able to engage and function better throughout their day because they're getting the required input at the required times. It's important to note that timetabling may need to change as the child grows and as the child's preferences change and needs change. So timetabling should be flexible, but by timetabling it, it just ensures that the child is getting the input at the times when it's most beneficial, as an occupational therapist will have devised. A sensory box is what it says on the tin. It's a box that contains different items which will provide different types of sensory input. These boxes are really great because they can be personalised and filled with items that your child specifically likes and can get the sensory information they need from them. They don't have to be kept in a box, they can be kept in a rucksack, which would then also make it travel friendly. And it's handy because it just feels like you've got a little toolbox with you for journeys to help your child use strategies to help them to either calm down or wake up, and most importantly, stop them before they get to that higher phase, that HOG phase. They're really great because you can also make them with your child, and your child can have input and really let you know what works for them and what doesn't. These should be kept handy. If you have one at home, it's always really handy to also give one to school, just so that they can also support your child the same way that you would at home. Now we're going to have a quick look at some of the useful pieces of equipment that you could use to support your child with their sensory needs. this slide shows some different types of weighted equipment that can be used with an individual who quite enjoys proprioceptive and tactile feedback to help them with calming. So here we've got a weighted blanket, a weighted jacket, and a lap pad or a lap belt. All of these provide proprioceptive and tactile input, and they are placed on the body and provide deep pressure to help calm the sensory system down. So that's if you've got somebody who is maybe quite alert, but maybe too alert, and you want to calm them back down so that they can come into the calm alert state. Weighted equipment should always be assessed for and always be prescribed by a qualified therapist. It's really important to note that weighted equipment should not be more than 10% of the body weight of the child. The child should be able to remove it independently if they want to, and they should always be supervised. No child should have weighted equipment and then just be left alone with it. It's really important in terms of keeping them safe, but not just that, also monitoring how the weighted equipment is working for them. These can be expensive, but they can be really useful when they do work. With weighted blankets, a lot of people get lost in the word blanket, and sometimes we have had reports that parents leave the blanket on the whole night. No piece of equipment should really be used for more than, I'd say, 20 minutes at a time as a general rule. However, of course, the OT that's prescribing the equipment would be able to give a more personalised restriction around timings, but we say that because after a while, if you continuously use a piece of equipment, it doesn't have the same effect that it did when you used it in the beginning, which means that it's then not really having an effect. It's not really giving that required input. Especially with weighted blankets, it's really important to remember that it's fine to use them in the beginning when helping a child go to sleep, but then it does need to be removed, and then if needed, another sensory strategy needs to be put in place to help them get to sleep, but it should not be kept on for the whole night. Next, we have vibrating equipment. Vibration is really, really good because not only does it have an immediate effect, it also can have a lasting effect. So once you remove it, you still have the residual effects, the residual feelings of vibration. What we've got here is a vibrating snake, a Z-Vibe, a vibrating cushion, and also a vibrating toy. Vibration can be funny, but children will let you know near enough immediately if it's something that they can tolerate and they enjoy, or whether it's something that they really dislike, because it can be quite intense for some people and they don't like that. For other people, they may actually really enjoy the intensity, and that's filling their cup. So Z-Vibes, we'd usually recommend to stimulate the oral cavity. So it provides proprioception just within the mouth. You can get different heads to attach to it depending on how much input they want to feel or they need. It can be really great for children who tend to put lots of items in their mouth or lick lots of things because they're craving that input around that oral cavity. So it can be really good for that. Vibrating snakes can be really good just to put around the shoulders or for children to hold on to, or to put somewhere on their body, just so that they're getting that proprioceptive input. They're getting lots of information to their joint receptors and their muscles. Vibrating cushions, again, can be held across the tummy. They may want to sit on it. They may want it on their back. As soon as you put pressure on the cushion, that's when the vibration starts. And again, it just gives lots of body feedback lots and lots of information. And we've got a vibrating sensory toy on there just for younger children who need that input, but it's just a bit more child friendly. It looks like one of their normal toys that they'd have, like a normal teddy bear, so it's just a lot more child friendly. Some further proprioceptive equipment that is available are things like the body sock. A body sock is really great. It's made out of lycra. It's very resistive. When you push against it, it gives lots of great feedback to your joints and your muscles and their receptors. They do come in adult sizes also, for any parents out there who think actually it looks pretty fun, or you would just like to do it alongside your child as well to show them how to do it. You don't have to put it over your head. Some children do like that, but other children would prefer to have their head out, so your child will let you know how they feel about it. They can even be worn when you are doing things such as an obstacle course or playing a game, just so they get that extra feedback and get the amount of proprioceptive feedback that their sensory system is seeking. Another piece of equipment is a bear hug, or it's also known as a compression vest. These vests are basically like having a big bear hug, which is why sometimes they're called bear hugs. There are some children that really love to be hugged and they'll really cling to parents, and they need that's what their sensory system is telling them they need. And because it could be because they're feeling a bit of gravitational insecurity, it could be because they need to know where their limbs are and what's going on, so that the only way they know how to do that is by hugging really tightly. So this basically, in a way, frees up your arms so that you can get on with cooking dinner or whatever it is you need to get on with, but they still feel like they're getting a really big hug from this piece of equipment. It can work really well, but like everything, it just needs to be monitored, and you need to be shown how to apply it so that you're not having it on too tightly, and also so that you're using the correct size for your child. A lycra tunnel is a little bit like a body sock, it's just that it's a tunnel. Again, great resistance and really great for proprioceptive feedback, and also really fun. Lots of children really love it, and parents will use it as part of an obstacle course, or they may use it for their child to go through to get to bed, just to give them that input so they can calm their sensory system ready for sleep. So they're another really great option. And we've also got a spiky massage ball. So these are really great because different spikes, as you roll it along the body, they're not uniform, they're random. So the spots where they're hitting on the skin give lots of random proprioception, but it can be quite in a small area and it can be quite intense, which some children really, really respond to.
If you find that your child is mouthing or chewing on non-edible items, then the use of oral equipment might be quite helpful. These equipments can help provide the oral input that your child may be seeking. They include use of the Z-Vibe, which provides vibration to the mouth area, which could be generally quite calming for children. However, we would recommend to trial this firstly with an electric toothbrush to ensure that your child is able to tolerate this. Also, a variety of chew buddies available, which vary in size, shape, and toughness. If you find that this does not work for your child, it might be worth trying a different shape or size or toughness to find one that your child does tolerate. Some chew buddies come with a lanyard so that the child can wear this around their neck so they are able to utilise this when they need to. Other varieties of chew buddies can be put onto the wrist as a bracelet or on top of pencils.
There is a variety of equipment which provides the opportunity for movement. This can be used for children who are seeking more movement through fidgeting or who require more movement to alert their sensory systems. So the sensory or gimbal and the trampet can be used to alert the system through jumping. The motion cone can be used by a child lying inside it and spinning. There are also the move and sit cushion and disco cushion, which can be used to provide movement whilst a child is sat at a table and doing focused work. Now, these two shouldn't be used for longer than 20 minutes to avoid habituation, and also they can be turned over onto their smoother side if the child doesn't tolerate the tactile bumps that are on one side of it. Another strategy that can be used to provide movement when a child is sat at a table is a resistant band, which can be used by tying it to the two legs of the chair and allowing the child to kick against it. Care must be taken, however, to remind the child that the resistance band is in place, because we don't want anyone to trip and fall over.
If your child is experiencing tactile sensitivities to clothing, then the TheraPressure brush could be quite useful in helping to reduce this. If this is an issue for your child, please get in touch with the occupational therapy team and we'll be able to support you in teaching you the body brushing programme to help with this. It is also important for your child to experience different tactile sensations, and this could be done through using tactile stepping stones or a tactile bag.
Sensory circuits are used to help children to self-regulate and stay in that nice, calm and alert state so that they're ready for learning and are able to focus. We find that they are particularly useful during periods of transition, however, they can be used at any time of day. Sensory circuits follow a strict pathway. They're divided into 3 sections. The first section is alerting. It's then followed by organising and then finishes with calming. It's very important that every time a circuit is done, it follows these 3 steps. They can be done with equipment or without, and we'll be going over these different activities that you can do in each section over the following slides. It's important to note that these circuits should be tailored for the needs of the individual child. For example, if your child is quite under-aroused and presenting like an Eeyore, they're going to need more activities from the alerting section. However, if they seem over-aroused and they're bouncing off the walls, then they're going to need more activities from the calming section. Now, these sensory circuits can be very, very quick and without the use of any equipment, or they can be slightly longer. They're very individualised and you can tailor it around your own practicalities and what you have available.
So some examples of alerting activities include jumping on a trampoline or trumpet, or bouncing on a gimbal. Or if you have no equipment, it could be completing star jumps, jumping up and down on the spot, running on the spot, or if you have access, having upbeat music in the background whilst completing this. The organising section comprises of the child needing to organise their body and plan their approach. Activities that can be completed include walking out over a gimbal and completing a jigsaw puzzle whilst doing this, or walking along stepping stones. However, if you do not have any equipment, you could always complete throwing and catching, animal walks, or using the pavement slabs to complete hopscotch.
And finally, we come to the calming section. To complete calming activities, you can use a gimbal, for example, to give ball squashes. Now, this involves your child lying face down on the floor and you providing deep pressure along their body through a gimbal. Now, you must be careful not to do this lightly, but to use firm, deep pressure on the child's back and legs to ensure that it has a calming effect. If you don't have this equipment at home, you can also get your child involved in heavy work activities around the house. Anything that involves resistance or using pressure and force will also have a calming impact on their system. So you can get them involved in the hoovering, the sweeping of the floor, carrying heavy bags, from the car, or if you're out and about, pushing a heavy shopping trolley. To complete a sensory circuit without equipment at home, you could use wall push-ups, which involves pressing against a wall back and forth. You can also do presses on the head, where you join your hands together and press down on top of your head. You could give yourself a squeeze using both hands around your arms, and chair push-ups, where you sit with your feet flat in a chair and your hands on either side and push up through your arms so that your bottom comes off the ground.
This brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening.